Howard. You see Howard's outside looking. My name is Terry Bristol. I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy. And thank you. And welcome to everybody to the 2009-2010 Science Technology Society Lectures, the Linus Pauling Memorial Lectures. And my primary role here is to thank the co-sponsors who make it possible for this to happen. First of all, Mentor Graphics Corporation, which has been our major corporate sponsor for a number of years. Thank you for that. Oregon Episcopal School, FEI Company, Portland State University, University of Oregon, Western Oregon University, Portland Community College, University of Portland, Clark College in Vancouver. Thank you. Onami, who's our nano people who are going to create all those jobs for you. FLIR Systems, the infrared guys, Pacific University, Reed College, and the Oregonian. And then specifically, the besides Mentor Graphics Corporation, Mentor Graphics Foundation has made a big grant to subsidize tickets for the actually K through 14 students, and so that's a big deal. Thank you very much to them. I'm going to be particularly brief. Everybody check your cell phones. Da-da-da-da. You've done that. And I'm just going to say very quickly, because there's a blurb in the program about Howard, and Howard's going to tell you a little bit about when he was here before. This is the second time we've had him here. But Howard Rheingold is someone who, when the internet started, I mean, when it was hardly, we didn't even know what it was. DARPANet and listservs first started. He was a leader in it, not just a leader in following what was going on, but a leader in doing and exploring and looking at the possibilities and encouraging other people to look at the possibilities of what was going to go on with the internet. And many of the things that he started that were embryonic have become huge. And this transformation that we're going through, which seems every few days seems to be a little bit different, which is extremely exciting and very, very encouraging that we're doing a lot of good things in the world here, of course, with all the potentials downs. But anyway, so I'm just going to let Howard lead off here. He's the probably one of the best consultants, best idea men, best insights on what's happening with the social media and with interactivity and this whole transformation we're going through. So help me welcome Howard Rheingold. Thank you, Terry.
Hello. You know, I've probably spoken hundreds, if not thousands of times in all kinds of places, and I've never started by doing what they call breaking the fourth wall like this. But I want to take this opportunity to tell you what a special place Portland has been in my life, and what a special place it has in my heart to this day. I arrived here in 1964 at age 17. I had a National Merit Scholarship, which meant I could choose my school, and the only place I applied was Reed. To this day, Reed sends out this kind of voodoo radar that bookish misfits all over the world tune into. And so 1964 to 1968 were tumultuous years, and there were a lot of changes in the world. So 4 years later, I graduated, and I left Portland, but Portland has never left me, and I've been back probably every other year since then, and I've been so happy with the way Portland has changed and the way Portland has not changed. And when my daughter was interested in urban studies in college, I brought her here to spend a week because I told her that Portland was a city that works. And we were very pleasantly surprised to see that that's what it says on the city trucks. And, I was actually on this stage in 1993, and I hear somebody say that they remember that. Was anybody here in 1993? Okay, so you may remember that I had a phone line and an ancient Macintosh and I think a 2400 baud modem, and I logged onto the well, which for most people, okay, wellites, my familia. It was 1994, I think, that the New Yorker cartoon came out, which was sort of the watershed on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. 1993, the idea that people would use computers to communicate was this kind of futuristic business. So, having said that, I'm here tonight to enlist you in helping spread a new story about the way humans and other creatures, for that matter, get things done. We all know the old story. It's one that our parents teach us. It's one that our schools teach us. It's what, until very recently, science has told us about how people do things together. Biology is war, in which only the fiercest competitors survive. Businesses and nations survive and thrive only by dominating, defeating, or destroying the competition. Politics is about your side winning at all costs. This was a while back. This was a politician in the Ukraine who was poisoned. That he didn't look like that all the time. He looked like that after he was poisoned by the opposition. But over the last 10 years now, I've been tracing the outlines of the emergence of a new story. It is a narrative in which competition is still central, but has shrunk a little bit to make room for some new knowledge that's emerged from a whole lot of different disciplines about cooperative arrangements and complex interdependencies. I started discovering this the way I discover most things. I stumbled on it and then started inquiring into what I had stumbled upon. And it started for me almost exactly 10 years to the day. I was in Tokyo in the spring of 2000. And when you go to Tokyo, it's very expensive to take the cab from the airport. So you take the subway, and then you're immersed when you get there. And I couldn't help notice that people on the street were doing something that in 2000, a lot of people in the world were doing, but Americans were not doing. They were walking down the street looking at their telephones. This was really, truly a strange sight for American eyes in 2000. No longer a strange sight. There are probably many of you in the audience who don't remember when people weren't looking at their telephones. There are a lot of strange sights to American eyes in Tokyo, so I didn't really think twice about it, but as it happened, I found myself just a few weeks later on the other side of the world in Helsinki. I was sitting in an outdoor cafe. Now, in Helsinki, people carry their phones in their hand. In fact, the Finnish word for mobile phone is a diminutive of the word hand. So it's like saying, did you bring your little hand with you? And I couldn't help notice that when three teenagers stopped to talk to two older adults just a few feet away from where I was sitting, speaking Finnish, I had no idea what they were saying, but I couldn't help notice that one of the young people looked at his phone and smiled. And he showed it to his two peers, who also smiled, but did not show it to the two older adults. And the conversation continued as if this was normal. And that's when I began thinking, okay, something's happening in Tokyo, something's happening in Helsinki, it's not happening in the United States. What's going on here? So I asked my friends in Finland, asked my friends in Japan, and that was the first clue. They used the same word. They said, oh, the kids today, they flock like birds. They all show up at the same fast food place, the same mall, the same time, because they've been, of course, exchanging SMS messages. I think we're up to 1 trillion SMS messages sent worldwide every year by this point. So that was intriguing. It wasn't yet enough for me to begin traveling around and doing the research necessary to write a book. But I read the newspaper about what was happening in Manila, and that struck me as being enough to begin defining something new emerging. You may remember that the president of the Philippines was Joseph Estrada. He was accused of corruption, and there was a trial there are hearings in the Philippine Congress. It was much like the Watergate hearings in the US in the 1970s. Everybody was glued to their television set watching what was happening there. And at some point, those hearings were shut down by senators who were associated with the Estrada regime. And that's when something extraordinary happened. Within minutes, tens of thousands of people began to pour into the main square in Manila, all of them wearing black, because they had been exchanging text messages on their phones that said, go to EDSA, the name of the square, wear black to mourn the death of democracy in the Philippines. And there, of course, were other factors involved, but the fact that millions of people showed up in that square over the next few days led to the fall of the Estrada regime. So that, to me, seemed like something was happening. I began to ask around, what might this possibly mean? And I found a sociologist who said, well, it seems to me like the threshold for collective action has been dramatically lowered by this technology. Collective action is a term that sociologists use that I had not been familiar with, but it struck me. Teenagers flocking, citizens demonstrating, that's collective action fits a lot of things. And if the threshold has been lowered and people are going to do things together that they haven't done together before, this could be big. So I ended up writing a book called Smart Mobs. I use the word mobs advisedly because it has an edge to it, and I'll get to that. And at the time I wrote that, 2001, it was published in 2002, it reminded me of where the PC was in the 1980s, the toy. Who could have foreseen Photoshop with a little black and white computer, or actually light green and dark green computer? Or back when I was on the stage in 1993 with that text slowly scrolling up the screen, who could have foreseen YouTube? So I saw the merger of the phone, the PC, and the internet into a new kind of technology. Now, of course, I think really the iPhone has captured the imagination of the world, and it's not a new thing to think of the phone as not just being a phone. But I still think we are going to see a lot more change, and I think a lot of it's going to be social as well as technological. So after my book came out, I began to hear about all kinds of other smart mob activity. This photograph was sent to me from Korea. There's a site there, a website called Oh My News. There's 50,000 citizen journalists, a couple of hundred professional editors. Hasn't really caught on around the world, but in Korea, it became a big deal among the young cyberculture. So democracy is a fairly new thing. Free press is a fairly new thing, about 30 years old in Korea. And the traditional mainstream press had a presidential candidate that they favored. And the presidential candidate that the young online crowd, the Oh My News crowd favored, was not really being covered by the mainstream press. And in fact, was losing in all the polls. Indeed, on election day, the early exit polls showed their candidate losing. So they put out a call on Oh My News for people to text their friends and get them out to vote. And in fact, they tipped that election, and President-elect Roe gave his first interview to Oh My News instead of the mainstream media. It's as if the President of the United States ignored the New York Times and ignored the Washington Post and spoke instead to the Huffington Post online. A few months later, the Korean Congress attempted to impeach President Roe. They called for demonstrations on Oh My News, and that's what this picture is from. That's what happened in the streets of Korea that night. A few months later, I got up in the morning and I knew that something had happened in Spain because I had received dozens of copies of this photograph in my email from people I didn't know but who had read Smart Mobs because they had recognized what was happening there. You may recall there were terrorist bombings in the trains in Madrid, and the government initially blamed it on Basque separatists. Because of Spanish election laws, political demonstrations were forbidden 3 days before the election. So people sent each other text messages on their mobile phones that said, the government is lying to us, show up in front of their headquarters. And that's what this photograph is about. And again, the election was tipped. The person who was expected to win lost, and another candidate won. Now, I'm not making a political statement. I don't really know enough about Philippine politics or Spanish politics to tell you whether or not people are better off with the results of these elections. But I do know that this is something new in the world. In the Ukraine, the Orange Revolution had a lot of what are now being called social media behind it. There are actually hundreds of examples of this. In the US, you may remember that there was an immigration bill proposed before Congress, and there were demonstrations, largely in Los Angeles. 20,000 high school students walked out of their schools to join these demonstrations because they had organized on MySpace. And I'm willing to make a substantial bet that 0% of those young people joined MySpace in order to become political organizers. But they recognized when there was a cause that meant something to them that they had a medium that they could use to, they don't know the word collective action, but they could get their act together. So I was in Chile in September a year ago, and they said, oh, we had a smart mob here. We call it the Penguin Revolution. So public school children in Chile wear uniforms that are black and white. So they're called penguins. And apparently the funding, public funding for education in Chile is very, very poor. And there's been some political controversy about it, but nothing really happened. The school kids themselves, we're talking about age 15 to 17, used a number of social media. They used instant messaging. They used a social network called Fotolog that's very popular in South America, and they used YouTube to organize. They not only walked out, they locked the doors to their schools. They marched in Santiago and Valparaiso, Concepcion. Tens of thousands of adults joined them in the streets. The Minister of Education resigned that night. They started a dialogue on education in Chile, which continues to this day. Not all smart mobs are peaceful and democratic. So I want to emphasize collective action by humans. Humans do a lot of socially beneficial things, and humans do destructive things together. And this amplifies the ability for people to do both. This is pictures from Moldova, where Twitter was used to help organize demonstrations, which you can see were not nonviolent. And I don't think that this is the last we're going to see of violent kind of demonstrations. We're now seeing these flash mobs happening in Baltimore, where hundreds of kids descend on downtown and get a little wild. It's happening with journalism. This was an easy prediction for me to make in 2002. It seemed futuristic. I said, in the not too distant future, you're going to see a world headline with a photograph that's going to come from somebody's telephone. You know, it seemed that does not seem futuristic at all now. This was the first instance, was the London tube bombing, which somebody sent this to Flickr with a Creative Commons license. So it was picked up by BBC and CNN and flashed around the world. This is George Allen, who is not the senator from the state of Virginia, because at this moment he made a racist remark that was captured on YouTube, changed the balance of power in the US Senate. It used to be if you were a politician, you knew, because that red light was on, and you knew it said ABC, CBS, or NBC on it. Now, the light is on wherever you go, and you don't know who's going to be putting what you said up on YouTube that night. A lot of the older generation are not going to be able to adjust to this, and we're going to see a lot more of George Allen from all political parties making gaffes that the world is going to see. I'm sure you remember this picture. The first photograph, that remarkable landing on the Hudson, came from somebody who sent their picture to Twitter. They happened to be a passenger on one of the ferries that diverted to rescue people then. So when I finished my book, I did something that I've never done before. I'm a freelancer. You know, like the shark has to keep moving, the freelancer has to keep moving to new projects. I didn't give up this study of this coevolution of communication media and collective action. And the more I looked into it, the more I became convinced that we are humans because we use communication media to do things together in new ways. Our primate ancestors, I learned, they're about 3 feet tall. They weighed about 50 pounds. No claws, no wings, no fangs, couldn't run. Their ancestors were up in the trees. They were safe. They descended to the savanna, which is a treeless plain, surrounded by saber-tooth everything. We don't really have any kind of records of this, any kind of physical evidence of it, but there's a pretty widespread agreement that collective food gathering, collective defense is what enabled those scrawny little creatures to become the most feared predators on the planet. For a lot longer than civilization has existed, for tens of thousands of years, humans roamed the earth as extended family hunting-gathering tribes. Now, the thing about humans is we need protein on a daily basis. If you're not fortunate enough to live in a place where there's abundant seafood, you need to keep moving. You need to try to bring down that small game. At some point, these family units began to merge into larger units, people who were not blood relatives, to hunt larger game. And we know that they were very successful within a couple of thousand years of arriving in North America. They drove all of the large mammals here to extinction. They organized, they used fire, they drove them off cliffs. Again, we don't have physical evidence for this, but I think logic tells us a couple of things. One, they had to solve what are known as collective action problems. It is dangerous, if not fatal, to try to hunt something this big if you are squabbling with the other hunters. They had to reach some kind of agreement, somehow. And I also think, for the first time, an abundance of wealth existed that they had to deal with socially. Suddenly, there was more protein than the hunters and the hunters' families could eat. So, did those who ate but didn't hunt owe something to the hunters? We don't really know, but I suspect that new social forms, new forms of communication must have emerged as a result. So let's jump forward to about 10,000 years ago. Civilization grew out of agriculture. Large cities for the first time began to emerge on plains. They were mostly built out of mud, bricks, and in fact that was the medium for the next communication breakthrough. Making marks on mud is what led, on clay, what led to the invention of writing. A woman by the name of Denise Schmandt-Besserat wrote a Scientific American article a couple of decades ago. She actually traced the origins of writing, and it had a lot to do with the administrators for these empires keeping track of what citizens owed and what they owed citizens. So if you brought 3 bushels of wheat to the imperial granary, they gave you these 3 little clay tokens. Eventually, they dismissed the tokens. They just put the marks of the tokens on a piece of clay, and that evolved into writing. But it had to do with keeping track for the emperor. And the priests who were the administrators were in charge of this new, very powerful secret weapon, the ability to transmit knowledge across time and space in a way that was unknown before. You know, before humans, our ancestors, that began to use hand axes, one form of hand axe of chipping stones in a complex manner to make an axe remained unchanged for 1 million years. Suddenly, instead of having to directly listen to an axe maker teach you how to do it, you could write down instructions. Things began to change very rapidly, but access to literacy, to this secret code, to the ability to encode and decode was really confined to an elite for thousands of years, controlled by whoever was running things, whether it was an emperor or a pope. About 500 years ago, that was cracked open by a new invention, the Gutenberg Press. The press had been invented in China and Korea. It really worked in Europe for reasons that are interesting and I think prove that technology is not deterministic. It really depends on cultural circumstances. But suddenly, the number of books, the number of literate people expanded. There are about 30,000 books written by hand, 30,000 individual volumes during Gutenberg's lifetime. 50 years after the invention of movable type, there were 50 million books in Europe. And the literate population expanded, exploded dramatically, and people who could read and write began to do things together that they had not been able to do before. Knowledge gathering, what we now know as science, had depended since forever on geniuses. You had to wait for an Aristotle to come along to apprehend the universe in a new way. The real genius of Baconian science was that if you had enough educated people who knew the rules, they could perform observations and experiments and report on them, and those reports would be published. People would begin to build on that knowledge. Knowledge gathering became a collective enterprise, a form of collective action in the knowledge domain that has largely brought us to where we are today in terms of science and technology. Elizabeth Eisenstein wrote a book about the printing press and change in early modern Europe and noted that priests had objected to the practices of the church before. But when Martin Luther nailed those handwritten 95 Theses onto that cathedral door in Wittenberg, printers were looking for new markets. And within 2 or 3 years, hundreds of thousands of copies of that were circulating. And it happened to be a real boost for this technology that the theology of what became known as Protestantism had to do with individuals reading the Bible in their own language. In fact, Gutenberg was an entrepreneur, and he got into the business of printing because he wanted to sell a lot of Bibles. The revolutions that overthrew monarchies and installed parliaments and congresses in Europe and on this continent were very much literate revolutions. In the continental United States, the revolution was organized by committees of correspondence who wrote to each other. And after the revolution, the big argument, the public debate, if only we had political debates like this today, it took place in letters to the editor. We call them the Federalist Papers now. Now, I'm not saying that the printing press created science or the Protestant Revolution or democracy. I am saying that you can't have those things unless you have a literate population. So the technology enables a medium. The medium can lead to a growth in literacy, and that literate population begins to experiment with things politically, in terms of knowledge, in terms of religion, that they had not experimented with for thousands of years before. New forms of economic production came along as well. And now certainly markets have to be as old as the crossroads, commerce even more ancient than that. But capitalism as we know it really came out of a series of inventions in the post-Gutenberg era. The corporation started in Amsterdam to help wealthy citizens join in the looting of Indonesia, as it turned out. The modern limited liability insurance company came out of Mr. Lloyd's coffee house in London. Double entry bookkeeping, invented in northern Italy, spread very quickly through cheap printed pamphlets that were distributed. So people could do things that enabled them to engage in trade with people that they weren't able to engage with before. You know, someone gave you a gold piece, you bid it to make sure it was gold. At some point, they could give you a piece of paper, and you could give them the equivalent in gold. That trust was enabled by a system that emerged from a literate society. I don't think we are finished with the creation of new forms of economic production. We don't really have a name for what's happening now. We're beginning to note that people are using the web and other technologies to do business in new ways, and we are seeing older corporations doing their business in ways that they hadn't done before. Big companies that had, IBM really invented the idea of having the monopoly on selling you the hardware, selling you the software, selling you the programming. They put thousands of patents into a public commons. People wouldn't have to pay a license fee for that if they made what they built available to others. And they also open sourced billions of dollars worth of software, not out of altruism, but because they were able to move from 0% of the revenues being support services for open source to the major source of revenue in 4 years. IBM would have gone the way of companies, a lot of companies that built computers that don't exist anymore if they had not made this change. HP, Sun, a lot of companies embraced this. Until the recent downfall, Toyota dominated the auto market by doing things differently. And I suspect that their downfall came because the way they were doing things changed. They had a system whereby anybody could stop the production line if they found a problem. They would create a jury that brought together people who were not working together, not related in the org chart, and who would issue a report, but they got to know each other, created what's known as a small world network within Toyota. They had a network system with their suppliers. The reason I'm telling you the story about Toyota is they had a fire in 1997 that burned down a plant that made a special part. Toyota didn't own this plant. It made a computerized brake assembly that was necessary for each of the 30,000 cars that came off the assembly line every day. So Toyota got its network together and figured out what kind of machines were in that plant, where you might find those machines today, how to get them into one place and hooked up together and running. And they only lost 3 days of production because they knew how to do a kind of collective action in the production process that Ford and General Motors did not know. Eli Lilly, in the notoriously secret and competitive pharmaceutical industry, created a market for solutions. You had to qualify to become part of this market. But once you were qualified, if you had a scientific problem of any kind that you could not solve, you could put it up, like on eBay, and people could bid on solving it for you. Within a couple of weeks, a pharmaceutical chemist who was stumped in the last stages of synthesis of a medicine put his problem up, and somebody said that they could solve it. They told him enough for a contract and money to change hands, and a petroleum chemist in Kazakhstan solved the problem that enabled them to finish that synthesis. Open source software has shown us, contrary to prior expectations, that thousands of people who were not working under the structure of the firm as we know it, and not working under the incentives of financial reward as we know them, have been able to create software in both the operating systems and the browser markets that have challenged the monopoly leaders in those fields. We've seen Google and Amazon, certainly companies that are not accused of altruism, open really their crown jewels. With Google, their robotic ad placement system. If you're a blogger, you can subscribe to AdSense. You can make a few dollars. Some people make serious money. Google makes a lot of money by sharing what they know how to do. Amazon opened the application programming interface to its crown jewels, its e-commerce system. And I think at last count, there were something like 200,000 different ways to use the Amazon system. There's something like 1 million people have Amazon shops on their website. Again, those individuals make a little bit of money, and Amazon makes a lot of money. So by sharing in ways that they never have before, companies, large companies, for-profit companies, capitalist companies, are managing to make more money than they were before. Companies that couldn't have existed before. eBay solves what's called the prisoner's dilemma. I'll get to that in a second. If you have a sofa and somebody on the other side of the country wants to buy it, you're going to wait till you get the check before you send the sofa. And they're going to wait till they get the sofa, till they send the check. That's the prisoner's dilemma. There is no market there. This buyer's marketplace, I'm sure many of you have used it. You check to see what people have to say about sellers before you buy something from them. That little bit of trust, again, like the beginning of capitalism, people were able to do transactions with people they were not able to do transactions with before, enable a market to exist that didn't exist before. Wikipedia, don't have to explain that. Who would have thought, not many years ago, certainly when I stood on this stage, that thousands of volunteers would start out to create an encyclopedia for everybody on Earth in their native language. I don't know how many millions of pages exist today. Again, knowledge gathering as a collective enterprise. A Media Lab student created a marketplace like Innocentive. This is a marketplace for solutions again, but this is solutions for people in the developing world who had problems that might be solved by design. And design students in universities around the world tried to solve the problem. So one of those problems was hydration for cholera victims. That's how you die from cholera, is dehydration. However, intravenous hydration is expensive, and if you don't know how to do it, if you do it improperly, you're going to spread disease rather than cure disease. The students at a design school brought the cost of hydration systems down from dollars to pennies, and they made it easy enough to use it. Illiterates could use it. This doesn't exist anymore. It should exist again. Anybody here belong to SETI at home? So a couple of people. SETI stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's a big radio telescope in Puerto Rico, sucks down signals from outer space, digitizes it, looks for patterns to see whether maybe there's communications there. This is not something that the US taxpayer wants to pay for. They were smart enough to create a screensaver people download when your laptop or your desktop computer goes to sleep, screensaver wakes up, downloads some of this data, runs a pattern recognition algorithm on it, sends the results back to headquarters. Now, the reason that this is important is not that there may be little purple people sending us messages. What's important is that several thousand volunteers created the most powerful supercomputer in the world, ahead of IBM, ahead of Fujitsu. You know, at the time I first started talking about this, it was 30 teraflops, 30 trillion operations per second. I think it's considerably faster than that now. It's not just looking for life in outer space. If you are trying to create a medicine, cure cancer, you have to deal with the way protein molecules fold on the surface of cells. Protein molecules are complex enough that the number of ways that they can fold and configure is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. So can't do a computer search and just find these. Certainly not with the kind of computation power available to biochemists. However, with volunteers, they've been able to take decades and centuries of computing time and reduce them to weeks. There's Fight AIDS at home. There are people who are trying to do simulations of the world weather system this way. I wonder, if we're talking about a future in which most of the people on Earth, I mean, there are 4 billion mobile phones now. The next 4 billion mobile phones will be supercomputers linked at broadband speeds. What kind of computation are they going to be able to do voluntarily, collectively, that can't be done with most powerful mainframes today? After natural disasters, we're beginning to see things happen because of the internet that haven't happened before. After the Asian Tsunami, within hours, the Asian Tsunami blog began putting together people who wanted to donate not only money, but 10,000 nails on a dock in Seattle for somebody in Indonesia who was making temporary housing. After Hurricane Katrina, many people were separated and were using things like Craigslist and Usenet and a lot of other internet-based systems to trying to find their relatives. A group of volunteers created a wiki, Katrina People Finder. Had some technical problems trying to scrape all this data and put it into a database. And they had some people from some of the major database companies working on this, were unable to solve it, till suddenly one of their volunteers solved it. The data began flowing. They figured out who had solved the problem. They called him, figured out what he had done. He said, I can tell you what I did, but my mom says I have to go to school now. He's 14 years old. Emergent collective response to disaster. People contributed more money to the Asian Tsunami Fund than the US government did through Amazon in the first few days. Jim Gray is a computer scientist, worked in the Bay Area for Microsoft Research. He took his sailboat out a couple of years ago, a sunny day, and he never came back. And that night, his friends at a number of companies, ordinarily competitors, Microsoft, Google, NASA, got together. They got NASA and Google to provide them with photographs from that day of that part of the Pacific outside the San Francisco Bay. They used Amazon engineers, cut these into 500,000 images, and volunteers went through 560,000 images in 5 days using the Mechanical Turk. They never found Jim Gray, but I think what's interesting about this is there's no institution for finding your friend who's lost at sea. They just put this together using available information and available services. On Twitter, some volunteers organized something they call Twestival. Twitter people like to make cute names that start with TW. Cute as it may be, a few tens of thousands of people contributed over $250,000 to create sources of drinkable water in 50 villages serving about 12,000 people. This happened in about a 2-week period from the first idea to the money beginning to flow. I think whether you are talking about nonprofits like ThinkCycle or the Omidyar Network or Creative Commons, or you're talking about profit-making companies, the reason that they've been able to succeed so well is because they've created platforms for participation that have enabled all kinds of people to volunteer and participate for all kinds of reasons. And I think that there are some design principles yet to be discovered that are the reason why these technologies enable people to perform collective action, to do things together in ways that they weren't able to do before. These were just the first off the top of my head, so I offer this as a challenge to anyone out there to begin thinking about this. I think that there are fortunes to be made, and there are social contributions to be made by figuring out how these technologies of cooperation are designed, and designing technologies that enable this kind of collective action. I won't go through these, but I want to point out this last one, leverage self-interest. A lot of what I'm talking about here sounds like altruism, but in fact, it has to do with people acting in their self-interest within an architecture that enables their individual actions to add up to a lot more, to a public good for everyone else. I am quite certain that no blogger is thinking, I am going to enrich Google today when I make this link. They're thinking, the people who follow my blog are going to find this link useful. Google, through its PageRank algorithm, has figured out a way to make a very useful search engine, which they give away. I really don't think we appreciate the value of free search. And then, of course, they take our attention and they sell that for advertising and make really good money from that. You don't have to click on those ads. So when I began changing from the technology to the social side of this, asking how does this happen, I found from my sociology friends that there are three kinds of social dilemmas. A social dilemma is the tension between individual self-interest and what can be done as a group. And it's a tension everybody participates in every day, and we do calculations about who can we trust and how much can we contribute and what's in it for me. And there are three mythic narratives, and I'm just going to quickly talk about two of them today, the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons. So the prisoner's dilemma was actually developed by nuclear war strategists at the Rand Corporation. They're trying to rationalize, come up with a mathematical way of forecasting the way two players who didn't communicate with each other might act in situations in which they couldn't trust each other. And they came up with a mathematical matrix, and someone came up with a story to explain this mathematical matrix. And the story is as follows. You and a friend are arrested by the police, and you're put in separate interrogation rooms. And you're told that if you confess and you rat out your buddy, you're going to get away with it, a lot less time served. You might even go free. So the penalties correspond with the payoff matrix. If both of you remain silent, you both go to jail for 6 months. If both of you betray each other, you both go to jail for 2 years. If you remain silent and your buddy betrays you, your buddy goes free and you get 10 years. So that's known as the temptation and the sucker's payoff. And in the prisoner's dilemma, people who can't trust the other side, again, remember eBay, choose between the solution that would work for best of us, let's have a transaction, and the one that's going to cause them the least damage. The prisoner's dilemma is really at the heart of many kinds of social dilemmas. It's only the prisoner's dilemma if you consider yourself to be a prisoner of it. And humans create ways to get around this. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Social scientists created another really interesting game about trust. They called the ultimatum game. Ultimatum game is played like this. Get two players, they don't know each other, they never meet, they're in separate rooms. You say to the first player, I'll give you $100. But you have to decide how much of that you're going to split with this second player that you're never going to meet, don't know, and don't communicate with. There is an assumption at the basis of classical economics, which is that we act in our rational self-interest. So it turns out it's interesting. I mean, why give anything to this other person? Turns out that a significant number of people do. Oh, yes, the second person. All they can do is accept or deny. So if they accept, both payers are played whatever the first payer proposes. So first player can get $90 and the second player can get $10 or split it 50-50, whatever the first player wants. Or they can deny and neither player is paid and everybody goes home and the game's over. So in rational self-interest, there's really no reason to deny a stranger $90 because you're only getting 10. Why not get the 10? Turns out a very significant number of players will deny payoffs if they don't feel that the payoff is relatively fair, something around 35-65 or 40-60. This implies, interestingly, that there's some kind of innate sense of fairness that humans have. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is some anthropologists took this and took it to a lot of different cultures and used the equivalent of $100, say a couple of days' work. They used this with hunter-gatherers in the Amazon. They used it with nomads in Central Asia, all kinds of different societies, and they found, strangely, that the results varied widely, that there were societies in which the first player was extremely generous, societies in which the first player was never generous, and there were societies in which the second player always accepted, and societies in which the second player never accepted, and that there is some correlation between the circumstances of life in those societies and the way they reacted. So I think a more interesting implication, rather than having an innate sense of fairness, we, through our culture, through the story that we tell each other, can create different kinds of trust. We can create different ways of cooperating or not cooperating with each other. A lot of the original notions around economics, that economics are based on, the rationally self-interested actor, have been overturned. It turns out that people will forego profit in order to punish cheaters. So if you take one of these games, the prisoner's dilemma game or the ultimatum game, and after the game's over, you tell people, you can punish the person who didn't cooperate with you and take some of their winnings, but it's going to cost some of your winnings. People will pay in order to punish. Not only that, they've put some of these people's brains in brain scanners while they're doing this game, and it turns out that the parts of the brain that light up when you are punishing a cheater are the same parts of the brain that light up when you are experiencing other kinds of satisfaction. Which led one scientist to declare that altruistic punishment may be the glue that holds societies together. I ask you to think about this the next time you get really pissed off when somebody cuts in line ahead of you. The other mythic narrative is the tragedy of the commons. Came from a paper that Garrett Hardin, a biologist, wrote in 1969. He was arguing that there should be an enforced population control because humans are going to overpopulate ourselves. He pointed to the fact that there were commons, common grazing areas in Europe, in which nobody owned and everybody could graze, and not because anybody really was hostile or socially destructive, but because it's in your self-interest to graze as many cattle or as many sheep as you can. They would overgraze the commons. So without regulation of the commons, Hardin declared, humans will always despoil what are called common pool resources. And that was a very widely debated paper because he was saying that we needed to have some kind of draconian enforcement of birth control in the world. It took almost 10 years for another scientist to say, well, is this really true? Do humans always despoil common pool resources? Of course we do a lot. Where are the salmon? Where are the forests? Where's the clean water? It's without question that people do despoil it. But the question is, that's why he called it a tragedy. Is it inevitable? So a political scientist went and studied all kinds of societies, families in Japan who had been harvesting forest resources from the same forests for generations, Spanish farmers who shared irrigation resources. She went through the kind of boring documents that led to the first water sharing agreements in Southern California. Her name was Eleanor Ostrom. She's kind of obscure. She published a book called Governing the Commons, in which she said there are groups of people who manage to overcome the prisoner's dilemma and create what she called institutions for collective action. This is not necessarily a law. A lot of it has to do with norms and agreements. Like, for instance, lobstermen in Maine. They would have a lottery about what days you could set your traps in the best trapping areas. And there was no law about this, and if you broke the rule, no police would come after you. You would find that your traps would mysteriously disappear. Things would disappear from your boat. It was kind of locally enforced. This all fell apart when boats became capable of intercontinental poaching. But she came up with a series of design principles that are present when these institutions work, usually, and absent when they don't work, usually. So I'm not saying that there is ever going to be an algorithm for human cooperation. Human collective action is a non-deterministic system, but it does follow design patterns, and if you adhere to these, people are more likely to cooperate. And in fact, there was a woman who took these principles to El Salvador, where they had a very, very bloody civil war, and she studied the way both sides had agreed to withdraw from conflict, and pointed out that these principles were present, and that if you wanted to write a treaty in circumstances like that, these design principles would lead to a treaty that people would be more likely to adhere to. Elinor Ostrom, you may or may not recall, won the Nobel Prize for economics this year. So what she said, and has been somewhat obscurely celebrated by a tiny portion of academics, is now becoming an accepted economic theory. She was a political scientist. There's some controversy about this. More recent research has shown that nice guys don't necessarily have to finish last. That if in a group, people who cooperate can find some others, and if they can make it seem socially acceptable, if they can make it seem fashionable to cooperate, then cooperation will spread in that group, and that group will compete favorably against other groups. So there is no interdisciplinary study of cooperation theory. I got together with the Institute for the Future in California, and we put together a lot of resources that we hope will be the foundation for an interdisciplinary study of cooperation. If you want to find out more, we taught a course at Stanford. We've got a lot of guest lectures. Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia talked there, and we put the videos up. We have a lot of source documents up there that have one-sentence summaries, that have one-paragraph summaries, or point to the original source document. So if you want to understand the economics or the political science or the computer science that's converging on this, it makes it easy for you to do so. And so you can go to cooperationcommons.com to find that material. So I think if you really want to look at where we are going in the future, you have to look not only at the technologies. I think you have to look at the literacies. And one thing that I discovered when I started teaching college students about 5 years ago is that this myth of the digital native is very misleading. Yes, they carry their laptops and their cell phones, they SMS, they Facebook. That does not necessarily mean they know how to use a blog to advocate. They've never heard of RSS for doing research. They don't know how to use a wiki to organize. These things are not rocket science, but they're nothing that's being taught. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm working on a book. I've got a bunch of blogs and videos out there about what I think are essential set of literacies for the 21st century, starting with attention, particularly in the classroom, is an important one. Participation. Most American teenagers have made something, if only a page on MySpace, on the internet. Critical consumption, or call it crap detection, the ability to determine what's true and what's not, and network awareness. And I think that these literacies need to work together. I think we need to teach them to our kids. They're not really rocket science. It's not even algebra or long division. It's mostly common sense. But of course, the technology is left way ahead of our educational system. I would like to see this taught at least in high school, if not before. And so that's what I'm working on next. I thank you for the gift of your attention. You can follow me on Twitter. You can see a lot of my videos at vlog.rheingold.com. 2 of my books, including The Virtual Community, are online in their entirety because the publishers didn't retain digital rights back in the olden days, on my website. That's all I have to say for the moment. I welcome questions. There are 2 microphones here for those of you who do have a question or a comment. I'll do my best to answer. Let's start over here.
Anselm here. Just
Anselm?
a quick question. Any comment on the Haiti response, the kind of crowdsourcing on trying to deal with the Haiti disaster?
You know, I don't know a great deal about that. Tell us something about it.
I watched the community, they mapped it out, they mapped out the streets, and they set up an SMS kind of crowdsourcing system where they looked at people reporting that they needed water or supplies, there were people trapped, and then they would send first responders. It was Ushahidi and OpenStreetMaps. And it seems like an example of that, but they weren't people on the ground, they were kind of crowdsourcing it and helping remotely. And it seems like that kind of thing.
Okay, so I do know a little bit about Ushahidi. Parts of the world, I think this originated in Africa, parts of the world where there are human rights violations, quite often the news of that, which of course, if you are a citizen, you want to know where not to go. Also, if you are the police or an emergency responder, you want to know where the trouble is. If you're a journalist, you want to cover the story. These are remote areas. It takes a long time to get there. By having people send in SMS messages and putting a pin on a simple Google map, Ushahidi makes it easy for people to instantly know where there is a natural disaster or potential human rights violations. I think we're going to see more and more of this crowdsourcing again. 4 billion mobile phones in the world. The fastest growing markets for mobile phones are India and China. The phone companies, they are building their phones for people who are barefoot, cannot otherwise afford technology. But this is a technology that can help feed their children. I have more to say about that if you like. But so over here, we had a question over here.
You mentioned the degree to which a lot of political changes came about due to the new media. To what extent do you think that played a role in the last presidential election?
Well, I think a real watershed has to do with the way money is raised. It used to be the $2,000 a plate, $5,000 a plate. A fat cat political donor was the most important. The watershed came during actually the Howard Dean campaign. Dean, of course, was a candidate who was not chosen by the Democratic National Committee. He was chosen by a bunch of bloggers. His campaign died in Iowa. So although his campaign pioneered a lot of things, they lost. So they must not have known how to do that final step. But there was a night in which the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party was having a $2,000 plate dinner. And so Howard Dean said, I'm going to eat a ham sandwich, and I want you to contribute on the internet. And they raised more money than has ever been raised in a 24-hour period before online. This does not belong to the Democratic Party. The Republicans have picked up on it. It's worldwide. The way money is raised now depends on $20 donors who are able to click. And I think that's enormously important. The other important thing is the Get Out the Vote campaign. That's where the Dean campaign died. They were not able to convince people in Iowa to vote for Dean. And I think a lot of the success of the Obama campaign had to do with the meeting of the top-down, of the organized political committees. But when they moved into a state, they found that there were all kinds of offices ready to open that people had self-organized. Certainly we're seeing this combination of top-down and bottom up with the Tea parties, you know, on the other side of the political spectrum. The mixture of organized and grassroots, I think, we're going to see that become more and more sophisticated. Democratizing access does not necessarily mean better democracy, but it does mean more participation. So it remains to be seen how healthy this phenomenon is going to be, but I think we're never going to go back to the age where just the political professionals were in control of US presidential campaigns. There are all kinds of other political levels, which people are using wikis to create laws. In New Zealand, there was a policing law in which citizens participated in the creation of that law. And a wiki, if you look up New Zealand police and wiki, you'll get that. The city of Melbourne used I don't know whether in Australia and New Zealand people are more polite than they are here. You know, the LA Times put up a wiki and they didn't have people policing it. And so the number of people putting up obscene photographs versus the number of people making cogent commentary it caused them to stop it. So I think you need to have some kind of mechanism for filtering, but it's clear that we're seeing all kinds of ways that the technology enables widened participation. There's a person up here. Sorry,
Yes.
I didn't see you up there.
Hi, Dr. Rheingold. First, thanks for coming. This has been a fascinating talk, and it's really nice of you to go the extra effort to come on a make-up call. Your last topic, though, about the needs for specific types of education for working in the network and that kind of thing, you talk about the young, but as a graying baby boomer, another group that is in desperate need are our parents. I can't tell you how much my parents want to be involved in that, but don't have a clue what's going on and trust the wrong things. And hopefully you can take that information and apply it to both ends of the spectrum. So.
Yes.
And perhaps just as a side thought, the blog or the wiki in LA is a good example of people despoiling the common good.
Yes. It turns out that you do need some regulation. Regulation that's agreed upon by the people who actually use the commons, that's enforced through norms rather than laws, works better than distant laws. I think studying this has pushed me politically more towards the libertarian side of the spectrum, because it's clear that people who make agreements with each other tend to self-enforce those agreements in ways that they maybe cheat if there's a law. I will say, if you're interested in this business of credibility online, I wrote a piece that a lot of people have used and linked to, and if you search on crap detection 101, you'll find it. And there are a lot of practical, there's a lot of practical advice there. And you know, it's not just political, it's not just finding out whether something's an urban legend. If you've got a disease, the internet is the world's best way to get a whole lot of bad information unless you know what you're looking for. And there are actually some browser add-ons that will give you some degree of support for the credibility of a health information site. So I think that we can improve the commons by increasing the number of people who don't fall for urban legends and hoaxes and misinformation and disinformation, and know a little bit about checking out what it is they got in the email, or what it is they found on a website. Again, it's not rocket science. I told my daughter when she started using search engines, is there an author for this page? If there's not an author, there's a thing called Who Is that will let you know what's behind it. I have a little 5-minute video on crap detection that uses a site called martinlutherking.org. Sounds like it's about the civil rights leader. It is about the civil rights leader. But the closer you look at this site, the worse Martin Luther King Jr. looks. If you do a Who Is search on the site, you'll find that it is actually owned by a group called Stormfront. If you do a search on Stormfront, you'll find that they are a neo-Nazi site. So this is what's known as a cloaked site. There are a lot of sites that are not just cloaked sites, they're just bad information that maybe looks good. Just look for an author, put the author's name in a search engine. How hard is that to do? Yes?
I was just wondering how what you thought the iPod or iPhone apps role they would play in these kinds of things. Many of them are free, and you can, anybody can create one.
Well, we could have a whole discussion about this. The iPhone and the iPad have opened up. Well, you know, the music business, people want to download their music and distribute music digitally, but Napster was illegal, and the recording industry started treating their customers as criminals. By controlling it, Apple managed to make downloading digital music pretty affordable. Instead of stealing it, people buy it. It's tightly controlled by Apple. It's not the open system that the internet is. Now we've got I was talking about the merger of the internet, which is open. If it wasn't open, Tim Berners-Lee wouldn't have gotten permission to distribute the web. The Google twins would not have been able to have the central wiring of the web changed to enable what they have to do. Openness is essential to the kind of innovation that we've seen. The phone industry was transformed, and we see this beautiful thing. I've got one. I love it. It is tightly controlled. Your app has to be approved by Apple. It is not an open system. It is illegal to crack it. The iPad, there's some real controversy now about the deal between the New York Times and Apple. So now we've got newspapers. What if Apple doesn't like what they have to say? Are they going to remove those apps? So there's some controversy about the iPad. It's a beautiful, beautiful toy. God knows I want one. But apps are not the same thing as websites. Your little brother is not going to be able to create one. Your little sister's not going to start a new industry. They may be able to create an app and make some real money, but they're not going to change the world unless Apple lets them. So I have a lot of mixed feelings. On the one hand, they kind of tame things like the music industry and the phone companies who never would have given up control, but they tame things by controlling them. So I think that there's a real tension there between opening technology to a lot of people and making it available, and the advent of a closed web, which I really fear is not going to lead to a lot of innovation and freedom. Jeff Jarvis has written something really important about the iPad in that regard. If you look up his website, it's called Buzz Machine. Yes.
Hi. My question is, what does it mean with the phenomenon of Facebook to drag around all the people you have ever met for the rest of your life with you? And to me, it seems like that there's going to be a sort of a trail of connectivity of all these people who you no longer have a immediate connection with, yet an awareness of what they're doing and what's happening in their lives. And suddenly I know way more than perhaps I thought I wanted to know, but it's still an interesting phenomenon that provides connection in a way that's meaningful to some of the things that you've touched on.
Facebook, too much information amplifier. All of the people you didn't like in high school can now follow everything that you've done. I haven't gotten to the point of quitting Facebook yet. It's useful for me. I'm a freelancer. I depend on getting the word out to my social networks, but it's a pain, and I don't like it that much.
But to say that it's a waste of time is something that you're in my generation can accuse it of, but it is going to be part and parcel of the next generation.
Okay, so again, to the literacies. I started teaching at Stanford and Berkeley the year in which Facebook became universal for college students. So for the first time ever, that cute guy or that cute girl that you saw in class, you went back and Facebooked them as soon as you were out of class, or God knows you opened your laptop while the professor was talking and Facebooked them. A radical change, and I think in many ways a very socially useful change for students. 4 years later, some of those students were shocked to discover they weren't getting into graduate schools, they weren't getting jobs, because people had looked at their drunken Facebook pictures. That you would think that literacy would be universal by now. It really isn't. So part of what I'm writing in my book is how do you think about and manage your digital footprint? Before you get online and your name and your picture is out there, how can you control what happens when people Google you and what's out of your control? I met a young man at an event like this who said he wanted to be a spy. He wanted to work for the NSA. He wanted to be a hacker for the intelligence service, and he kept information about him off the internet scrupulously, but he has no control of somebody else taking a picture of him, putting it on Facebook, tagging it with his name. He's got to go search for that and detag it. How many people here know the word detag? I mean, you got to go and undo something in order to have privacy. So I'm pretty libertarian about not having the government control what people do. I think it's important to teach people what to do. It's a little bit hard to control what other people do with your reputation, but I think Facebook, unfortunately, is here to stay. They've got a critical mass. But gee whiz, does anybody remember 6 Degrees? Does anybody here remember 6 Degrees? I mean, social networks have come and gone. Facebook has kind of got a ratchet there. I don't think that they're going to go back. I think new things are going to arise, but how do you manage? I think you, as an individual, particularly when you're starting out, have to take charge of managing your digital footprint. We're never going to see the government make laws about it. I don't think the government should make laws about it. The only way to control it is through knowledge and education. And I don't know how much we can control it. I think it's out of control. Privacy, Scott McNeely of Sun said this about 10 years ago. Privacy, it's over. Get used to it. Gee, I'm afraid he's right. Privacy is a social construction, differs from country to country, you know. People in most of the world used to sleep in the same room before there was, central heating. You slept where the fireplace was. People in Japan, where until pretty recently most of the houses were made of paper, pretended not to hear what their neighbors were talking about. That social construction is changing radically. The way in which young people regard what is private and what they share with the world has changed. I think there's something interesting about that. I won't go on too long here, but so this collective action business, there's something called collective action theory. There's a person who wrote The Logic of Collective Action, it's kind of the Bible of collective action theory, and he said that a group of unrelated people who do not have financial incentives will not create public goods above a certain size. You might get together with a couple of dozen of your friends, but you're not going to get 1,000 people to do it. Well, obviously, we've got Wikipedia and open source. Mancur-Olson, kind of the gold standard of collective action theory, is wrong. What's going on here? There's some researchers at the University of California at Santa Barbara have proposed a theory that that's what's shifted is the line between private and public, and that it's kind of porous. So if young people today, who are going to be the world's citizens running things tomorrow, have a different boundary for public and private, does that mean that they are more likely to engage in collective action and create public goods? I think that's a really, really interesting question. It may be that a lack of privacy has benefits. Question over here.
Yes, I'd like to know your thoughts on a problem I see in, for example, Negroponte's one laptop per child, and a lot of children having computers, and this is a very powerful tool, but their teachers and other adults really don't even know these literacies to teach them. How would you address this?
Well, I think it's a noble effort, and I think we're better off with it than without it. By the way, the lighting, for a second, I thought Bill Gates had stepped up to the microphone here. I was a little disappointed that Negroponte, with the resources that were available to him, did not have teacher training, did not have parent training made easily available to the people who wanted to do it. Face it, A lot of people spend all day making a living, and they come home and they want to take their shoes off and have a beer and watch the tube. They don't know what their kids are doing. They're afraid of what their kids are doing. They're, you know, presumably they know enough about sex that their kids don't know to have the conversation with them. But they don't have the conversation about technology because they are afraid, and they are correct, that their kids know a heck of a lot more about the technology than they do. And so you've got a MySpace page and you've got a Facebook page, and your parents find out about it, you just create a new one. I think parents should talk with their kids about what's going on online. And they, you know what? I think it's tremendously empowering to have your parents say, I don't know what's going on here, teach me. So, okay, maybe you can deceive them, but I think that you are less likely to deceive a parent who's really interested in what you're doing, and sits down and listens to you. So, you know, I don't think that there are simple solutions to these complex problems, but I think there are some simple things that people ought to try, and I think that the fear of lack of technical knowledge is something that we can educate parents about. And I think that they've gotten the wrong education. I think the fear parents have is about predators online. So Sonia Livingston, London School of Economics, just has a book out called Children on the Internet. They did a controlled study of 1 million young people on the internet. Of 1 million young people on the internet, about 6 of them will be molested by strangers that they meet on the internet. About 50,000 of them will be molested by Uncle Charlie or their next door neighbor. If you're really concerned about the sexual exploitation of young people, you need to talk to them about Uncle Charlie and their neighbor. The biggest danger of your kids getting on the internet is that they're not going to know crap from real information, I think. That was the attitude I took with my daughter. And I said, look, somebody calls on the phone and we're not home. Are you going to tell them you're home alone? Or what are you going to tell a stranger on the phone? Well, don't tell a stranger the same things on the internet. That's really common sense. And you know what? Most kids know that. Most kids know that. And most kids communicate with people they know online, and they're suspicious. If they get into sex chats with adults, there's something else wrong at home. It ain't the internet that's doing it. The internet affords it, but there's some other problems. Yes?
So cooperation seems like a really obviously good thing, but it's taken us a really long time to get to a place where all of a sudden we're really excited about it. And I was wondering if you think there's any reason for that. Are we just like getting out of some universal prisoner's dilemma, or what's going on right now?
Well, like I said at the beginning, I think a lot of it has to do with the narrative. Darwin actually recognized the importance of what biologists call mutualistic relationships, cooperative relationships. But the defenders of Darwin in the 19th century really latched onto this fierce competition in nature, red in tooth and claw, and they pushed this story that competition is the driving force of evolution. And in fact, we're really talking here scientifically. The biological idea that there are widespread cooperative relationships was taboo until Lynn Margulis really nailed down the evidence that the mitochondria, the little energy dynamos that make the cells in every animal work, were actually external organisms that were incorporated a long time ago by a cell, and that there is in fact a symbiotic partnership relationship there. Since Margulis made that breakthrough, then biologists have begun to understand that ecosystems have a lot of cooperation. There's a tension between cooperation and competition in biology, in economics, and biology that really has not been the story. So I think narrative is really important. And I think scientific knowledge is also important. Ostrom, nobody sat down and looked at the evidence of people using common pool resources before Ostrom. So, you know, I think there is an evolution of scientific knowledge, and there is also an evolution of how does the empirically peer-reviewed, tested knowledge translate into common understanding or popular narrative. And I think I think the internet has made it obvious that there are new things that people do together. And I naively set out to catalyze I had not had experience with universities before, so I did not understand the barriers to interdisciplinary work. People succeed in institutions that create knowledge because they are better and better at narrower and narrower specialties. The institutions don't create barriers to cooperation. They just create incentives not to cooperate. Yochai Benkler at Harvard Berkman Center has started a Center for the Study of Cooperation. So I think it takes a long time for these things, actually, for scientific paradigms to change. But I think we're seeing the beginnings of some understanding there. And after all, if you're a biologist, you don't speak the language of economists. If you're an economist, you don't understand what computer scientists are saying. There's a need for what are called trading languages, boundary objects. It's not impossible. I think it's important. Not necessarily going to happen just because it's a good thing. And let me say, cooperation, people cooperate to do awful things. Collective action is not pretty sometimes. So I don't believe that technologies have magical utopian powers. I think what we know about how to use technologies is an important determining factor.
Thanks.
So another question over here?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
I'm interested in knowing your thoughts on the future of face-to-face communication and how that will affect the social constructs.
There's a lot of folk knowledge, and science has its limits. Not everything can be measured and weighed, but that's how we settle arguments about things like this. Barry Wellman, the University of Toronto, very recently has published a study that shows that heavy internet users have more face-to-face relationships than non-heavy internet users. I think context is important. There are people who should not be spending all day long. I think particularly young people who ought to be out meeting people face-to-face. They should not be spending all of their time in a mediated relationship. But I think it is a mistake to think that mediated relationships are the death of face-to-face relationships. There are many people here tonight who I now know face-to-face, but I originally met online. And there is a natural progression. With some of the people you communicate with online, you want to end up meeting them face-to-face. I think, boy, Portland, people really occupy the city here. There's a lot of face-to-face action. A city is a technology. The way in which either the automobile or the pedestrian is privileged in the planning of a city has a lot to do with whether there's going to be face-to-face interaction. Are there public places where people from different classes of different races can get together and just enjoy the day together? Maybe they interact, maybe they don't interact, but at least they share a common space. I mean, one of the things I love about Portland is that it does afford that. A lot of the aftermath of the automobile has been the growth of suburbia and exurbia. You don't work and live in the same place. You spend a lot of time getting back and forth between them. You have less time to talk to your neighbors, the people you have relationships with in your work life. You're not going to go drive back to see them in the evening. So I think it's a complicated story. I think it's vitally important to humans. It's, again, built into our biology to have face-to-face relationships. Trust. There are so many cues for trust that you get face-to-face that you don't get online. Deception is easier online. Deception is certainly possible face-to-face, but there are all kinds of cues that you get from people face-to-face. And, you know, it's the birds and the bees. You can't kiss somebody, you can't punch somebody in the nose. There are advantages and disadvantages to that.
Thank you.
Is that another presented question? Okay, last question here.
Do you distinguish between cooperation and collaboration, or do you see them as two flavors of the same thing?
Okay, so collaboration, cooperation, and coordination, you can really parse that down. There's a young man by the name of Mark Elliott, 2 L's and 2 T's, who wrote a PhD thesis in which he actually did parse this out really well. But collaboration, I believe, has to do with a group of people who may or may not all know each other, but who have agreed on a common goal. I think that a market is a form of collective action in which people do not have agreements with each other other than to vaguely, roughly play by the rules, and that prices are signals in a market that coordinate the production and distribution of goods. And markets, a free market depends on people playing by basic rules. If, for example, you are a public corporation and you are soliciting investment, then the people you hire to do your books and make public statements about your bottom line, i.e. Enron, they can't be people you own. They have to play by certain agreed upon rules. So I think markets are complex cooperation systems. I don't think that they're particularly collaboration. I think you see Wikipedia is a great example, I think, of collaboration. People need to work together or you have edit wars. So again, you know, I'm touched that so many people haven't left. Thank you. That's a great tribute. Appreciate it.